here we go. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador John Limbert. John Limbert, as you know, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Iran in Sanandaj from 1964 to 1966, and then he was an instructor at Shiraz University from 1969 to 72. So let's see, John currently teaches at he's a, sorry, let me start over. John is an emeritus faculty member of the United States Naval Academy, and he lives in Virginia. I'm sorry, I'm still so emotional from that pledge. I'm not doing you justice, John. It's a great honor for me to call John a friend, as well as his distinguished career of service. So let me just introduce John, and John, maybe you can tell us about yourself.
Jackie, thank you. So thank you so much for that most emotional of introductions. I could spend the whole time that I have handing out thank yous and recognition to to so many friends and colleagues and teachers, everyone. So let me just give special thanks to the wonderful team who organized this group. What a terrific job they did. And also to recognize, if I can, the teachers, trainers, staff members who made Iran Peace Corps work. Despite the best efforts of us volunteers to send it in other directions. Let me recognize, maybe someone has already done this the first day, but I'm going to do it myself, and that's Gretchen Kafuri, who unfortunately is no longer among us. But I remember her so well from Portland. She was such a good spirit there when we were in Portland, when we met in Portland last time. And then I also recall from 1965 how she and Steve hosted me and my roommate Ed Cato at their place in Zanjan for what seemed to us a short time, a couple of days. I'm sure it seemed quite a longer time for Gretchen. It's such a pleasure to be here with friends who appreciate a message of dialogue, of empathy, and understanding. Frankly, it's also a change. As I'm sure all of you know, not everyone welcomes this message that we carry. Sadly, there's been little market out there for the voices of balance and good sense on either side of the divide. When we urge a different course, we are called delusional, or worse. To American audiences, I am sometimes called the Manchurian candidate. You know the story, the prisoner who was brainwashed and comes back as the operative, the wonderful movie. If you remember Lawrence Harvey and Frank Sinatra, it's great. I can talk. In this group, I can say that, and people know what I'm talking about. Iranians, some Iranians are a little bit blunter in the way they describe me.
Confusing. Like this one up here. Those of you who remember your Persian will see that it points in one to the right. If you want the Islamic Republic, you go to the right. If you want freedom, you have to go to the left. Any different? But the question I'm going to talk about today, and I want to leave some time to hear from you, because there's so much energy, there's so many good thoughts here, so much experience in this room. I want to leave time for that. But the question is, how do we literally and figuratively find our way back to Tehran after so many years, so many disasters, and so much that never should have been said or done? There's a lot to undo. I mean, here's the road that we've been on. Getting off this road, which we've been on for 35 years, has proved to be very, very difficult. Much more difficult than I thought it would ever be. Why is that so? Why is it taking us so long? Why have we been stuck on this road for so long? Because I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer. I make this question my students' final exam question in a political science course that I teach
at the Naval Academy. By the way, I'm not emeritus yet. I know I'm old, but not there yet. Not there yet. Still teaching. But so I put the question to them. I said, why have we been stuck on this road for so long? And I find that this very talented group of 20-year-olds who've been at the subject for 4 or 5 months, they're completely new to the subject. Their ideas of Iran previously come from the 300 movies, if you're familiar with those. But they're quick, and so they write some pretty good answers. They include terms like humiliation, justice, mistrust, concessions, capitulations, grievance, Turkmenchai, Mossadegh, Airbus, hostages, and of course all those recent favorites, centrifuges and subterfuges. But let me start with a metaphor that I cannot use it with my students. So I thought when I knew I was coming here, I said I can use this metaphor here. That's great. How many people here remember the old radio show, The Shadow? Oh, wonderful. Oh, God. That's great. Can you imagine what would happen if I asked that question of my students? You remember in The Shadow that Lamont Cranston had the power to cloud men's minds. And it didn't say exactly where he got that power, but it said in the East. In the East, well, for one, I'm not going to belabor the obvious, but it's pretty clear to me that probably was Iran. Because, what is it about Iran that gives it the power to cloud men's minds? Because that seems to have happened over the last 35, 40, or maybe even 60 years. But it's been a long time. Unlike the Shadow's power worked everywhere. Iran's power seems to be stronger in some places than in others. In Washington, where I live, believe me, the cloud is very thick. But I regret to say that it also seems to be very thick at Harvard. my own alma mater. Harvard seems to sit in a valley where the clouds of error about Iran never lift. Seem to be pretty hard. Let me give you some examples. A recent NPR interview, Harvard PhD and former government professor Henry Kissinger spoke about threats from a, quote, new Persian Empire. Now, what's he talking about? What's he talking about? Well, of course, at one time, the old Persian Empire was pretty impressive. Here's a famous rock carving at Naxar-Rostam. Most of you have probably seen it. And you visited this monument. You know that it commemorates Sasanian Emperor Shapur I, his defeat of the Roman Emperor Licinius Valerianus. We know him as Valerian. In the year 260 of the Common Era. Now, in those days, humbling and here there is Valerian himself kneeling before the emperor, kneeling in surrender before the emperor, and humiliating the armies of mighty Rome was a big deal in the year 260, and Shapur wanted it commemorated. He called in his sculptors and he said, "Forget Mount Rushmore. I want it big. I want it big." As I recall, if you or I were here, we'd come up to about here on the horse. On the horse. But that glory, let's face it, that glory of ancient Iran, as much as some people don't want to admit it, that was a long time ago. Very long time ago. And despite the good professor's warning, there has not been a Persian empire worthy of the name since the year 650 of the Common Era. So what's he talking about? Let me give you another Harvard story. Another Harvard graduate who was a recent presidential candidate.
Can we hold our nose?
Sure, whatever you like. Had trouble with Iran's geography. Now, obviously, Henry had trouble with its history. This one had trouble with its geography, because at one time he said in one of his debates, he said famously, Iran needs its relations with Syria in order to guarantee access to the sea. Now, where does that come from? Last time I looked, Iran had no trouble with access to the sea. I know some of you served along the sea, and know that better than I do. But what is it about my beloved Harvard that its graduates, although the latter case, I must admit, was from the business school, they don't know the basics of Iran's history or geography? What is it? The only thing I can come up with is the shadow is at work and is clouding men's minds up in Cambridge. Now, some of us here in this room have already physically, we've taken the road back in what must be, and I can only imagine, must be an amazing experience. I'm obviously jealous. I regret that Parvaneh and I, who would love to take our children back to where they were born, and our grandchildren to see where their grandmother's family came from, but for the moment, we're not welcome. Now, I'm not welcome. I know, I'm pretty sure why. I suspect that I am a reminder of a very ugly chapter in Iran's recent history that many would prefer to ignore or forget. I remind people of something that they would like to believe happened, to quote a recent movie, not a very recent movie, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Now, so how do we get on the road back? How do we get on the road back after so long? The first step, I think, is to deal with a history that we can neither undo nor forget. We can't just get over it. It's out there. We have to deal with it some way. I call this history the ghosts in the room. And if you ignore them, the ghosts are there. They're still there. And if you ignore them, they will still haunt you. You have to deal with them, exorcise them, call the Ghostbusters, something to deal with them. But the reality is that the good news is that the history should not just block the road. It should also open the road. Of course, there are ugly obstacles on that road. There are coups, there are dead airline passengers, there are victims of terrorism, there are hostages, and none of that's going to go away. But there's also a positive side of the history that we should ignore. And I think if it's understood, will help us open the road. By training, I'm a historian, so I always say, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the beginning. But I won't go back to the Medes and the Persians this time, or the book of Daniel, or those kinds of things. But let's go back to like about a century ago, to 1906. And the reality is that for over 100 years, our Iranian friends, such as these gentlemen, have been engaged in a long-term and often losing struggle to assert their pride, their identity, and to become masters in their own house. And as I said, this struggle has not been an easy one. And it's been defeated more often than not. It's numerous defeats, numerous setbacks, but the point is, it continues. And here's an early manifestation of that struggle. In 1906, these gentlemen, and in those days it was all gentlemen, were demanding a constitution. One of what became one of the, I think, the earliest written constitution in the Middle East. This is somewhat debatable with our Turkish friends, but if not the first, it was at least the second. And because why? Because they wanted a set of laws that would make their rulers had to answer to, so that their rulers could not simply sell off the wealth of the country, such as the oil, as they did in 1901, as the Shah did in 1901, in order to at fire sale prices, to raise quick cash to finance his court, his jewels, his harem, and his trips to Europe. They said, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. Now, the interesting thing about this picture is these are, as you notice, these are all clerics in the group, or at least all that you can see. Now, here's a question for you. Why would this struggle be led by the clerics in 1906? Anyone can guess? Pardon? Exactly. This was the intelligentsia. This was the intelligentsia of Iran in 1906. What was the literacy rate of Iran then? Anyone know? 5%. 5%. This is according to Ervan Abrahamian's research. Has come up with that. Life expectancy was about 30 years, and literacy was about 5%. And this was the literate group. These were the people who were educated, and they knew and they understood there's another way of doing things where the rulers can't necessarily sell off the wealth or give the wealth away to foreigners, are subject to a set of laws, to a set of restrictions. Now, in that 100-year struggle, the interesting thing is that the United States, we have often been on the right side. We were often on the good side. Here is a slide from 1910. This is the famous Morgan Schuster mission. His team, sent by President Taft, is in Tehran with their Iranian colleagues, whom you see, here, helping the new constitutional government, the new parliament, established 4 years earlier, to gain control of the country's finances. Because they knew if they didn't control the money, they controlled nothing. If they were going to work, if the new system was going to work, they had to have some control over the money. Now we know the story. That mission ended in defeat, tragically, because of great power politics. Won't go. You can read his book, The Strangling of Persia. It remains 100 years later a very powerful story. Here's another case. This is 1924. I was talking to someone yesterday who had served in Tabriz. Is he here today? Yeah. Were we talking yesterday about this? No.
I was in Tabriz.
No, but this was someone who's... I don't know why. No, this is someone whose parents had been missionaries.
Right here.
Oh, there you are. Good. Your parents were missionaries there. Okay, I don't know if your parents are in this slide or not. Maybe earlier. This might be grandparents. But this is like a faculty photo from something, and you can read the Persian up there. It's a little hard to read, but it says, on the occasion of the 33rd year of the Tabriz Memorial School, 1924. And here's the faculty. But what is fascinating about this picture is that you have people with completely different social, religious views all together working for a single goal. I mean, look at this. You have, obviously, the foreign missionaries. If this was a Presbyterian school, there would be the Americans. I presume it was, because that was the area where the Americans operated. You have probably their wives also teach. If you have teaching, you have Iranians, as you can see, what were, I guess, called the fokoli, the necktie wearers. That's a kind of a term of ridicule in Iran, but it really isn't. Fokol, does anyone know the origin of it? It's French. It means false collar. That's all it means. Someone who wore a false collar, as they did in those days. So you have the Iranians, as you can see, there, their Iranian colleagues, and then you have two clerics in the group. I mean, people with vastly different views of the world, but at the same time sharing the most important value, which is education. Whatever else we disagree on, however else we look at the world, I can't imagine much in common between the missionaries and the clerics here, but they all agreed we need to educate our young people. Iran has to do better than a 5% literacy. literacy rate. Now, the interesting thing to me is that today, you could never get a picture like this. Can you imagine? I just couldn't imagine it. You know, the women in the picture, the people with the neckties, the clerics, I mean, just couldn't do it. But this is 1920, this is almost 100 years ago. Now, here's a later photo from that same struggle. This is the early 50s. This is the early 50s. This is during the struggle over the oil nationalization during the Mossadegh period. During the Mossadegh period, this is a demonstration in front of the parliament in the Baharistan Square, in front of the parliament. And what's happening? Well, the Iranians are. You know, earlier they wanted to get control of their finances. Now they want to get control of their oil. This is their one resource. And they knew if they didn't control their oil, which had been under British control since its discovery in 1908, they controlled nothing. They controlled nothing. That the destiny of the country was out of their hands. And what I love about this slide is the very simple and elegant banner. You can read it. Millat maro azad bigzari. Leave our country alone. Leave our country alone. Let it be free. Let it be free. Now, in this dispute, too, the U.S. was originally on the right side. Or what I call, at least I think it was the right side. I think it was the right side. And here's President Truman in Washington receiving Prime Minister Mossadegh during his visit to the UN. Actually, came to argue Iran's case at the UN in 1951. And Truman originally took on a mediation role, because after all, Iran was our friend and Britain was our friend. Now we know how that episode ended. Ended very tragically. That still casts a shadow over our history and casts it today. Here is some of the coup makers. Here are some of the coup makers in 1953. I think this is, if I'm not wrong, this may be Shaban Bimoch, Shaban the Brainless, whom I remember very well. People talking about during our Peace Corps training in the University of Michigan in 1964. You could, when we went to Tehran, our group went to Tehran, I met some Iranian young men, and they took me to his Zurkhane, which the Shah had financed for him. So, what has kept us off the road back? What has kept us on that road to nowhere that I showed you earlier? Basically, I think the obstacles have been fear, lack of empathy, ignorance, and its most destructive companion, obliviousness. Let's talk about fear. Talk about fear for a minute. I retired from government service in 1906. I love it. See, there I was. I'd had enough. I'd had enough here. Enough of this. Enough of politics. 2006. And I did go back for a year in the beginning of the Obama administration to work on Iranian affairs in the State Department. And from where I sat, it appeared that President Obama was making a sincere effort to establish a new relationship with Iran after 33 years of something that hadn't worked. Simply hadn't. What we had been doing had not worked. He talked about an agaz novin, a new beginning, with Iran based on mutual interest and mutual respect, something that the Islamic Republic had always said that it wanted. But at the time, it didn't work. This was 2009, 2010. The process, for all kinds of reasons, didn't go forward. It took 4 years and some very harsh language before there was really any kind of response from the Islamic Republic. I think part of the reason, there are a number of reasons, but I think part of the reason was that President Obama's offers, it caught the leaders of the Islamic Republic off guard. It caught the leaders of the Islamic Republic off guard. Because, I mean, to George Bush's bellicose comments about an axis of evil, they knew how to respond. That was easy. You bash us, we bash you. Enemies are easy to deal with. You know how to deal with an enemy. But how do you respond to someone who quotes Persian poetry to you, who sends you greetings on Nowruz, and who speaks of mutual respect? It's different. That's hard. The old slogans like Amrika, Amrika, Marg bar ne rang to, death to your trickery, death to your deceit, that doesn't work anymore. It rings hollow in such a setting. And so what happened was, in the Islamic Republic, the leaders found themselves facing not an enemy who would have been easy to deal with, but something more dangerous, a rival. But not a rival in the usual sense. The Persian word I use here is habu. You know what habu is? Habu is a co-wife. Younger, prettier, more attractive, and very dangerous. And that's what they were looking at. And I don't think they knew how to respond. Bash they could do, denounce they could do, but respond to this they couldn't do. It was very hard. Took about 4 or 5 years before they could. Now let me talk about. This is fear. So I think this created fear. Let me talk about obliviousness a little bit. When the president says, don't do or don't say stupid stuff, that sounds simple, but it's pretty profound. Because he's talking about statements or actions that have consequences, that carry consequences. When you do things, there are results. Let me give you an example. You know what this is, of course. Well, it's a DNA slide. It's a DNA slide. And as for saying stupid stuff, you remember we had one of our officials who spoke about deception being in the Iranian DNA. From someone who calls herself a diplomat. Well, that's not going to open the road back. That's going to shut it down. That could shut it down. It could have derailed the whole process that had just started back in 2013. My question, of course, would be, well, wait a minute. Are you a geneticist that you talk about somebody else's DNA? But this obliviousness is, I think, in some ways, the hardest thing. It's the biggest obstacle to overcome. For example, now when a few months after I got to Iran, after our group got to Iran, there was a huge controversy over a draft so-called SOFA agreement, Status of Forces agreement, which the U.S. wanted the Iranians to sign. Now, talk about obliviousness, I didn't know anything about it. There was nothing in the news, of course. There was nothing on the radio. And nobody would talk about it in front of me, but it was a huge issue. Because the Americans, for reasons that I won't get into here, we asked the Iranians to modify the existing status of forces agreement, the agreement that regulated the status of American military personnel in the country, to open it up to include advisors, military advisors, and their family members. This was in 1963, 1964. And what we did obliviously was to give the world's biggest gift, a huge gift, to this gentleman, to Ayatollah Khomeini, who up until that time had been kind of a fringe figure on the right. He had been talking against land reform, he had been talking against votes for women, he'd been talking about the local councils law, which allowed religious minorities to stand alongside Muslims on the same slate. These were not big national issues. But now we've given him a gift. Because what he did was take this agreement and say, aha, we are giving up our sovereignty. And when was the last time that happened? Over there, 1828, the Treaty of Turkmenchai. Now, you all know what the Treaty of Turkmenchai is. Most people think Turkmenchai is something you get at Starbucks. But, it is known as the disgraceful Treaty of Turkmenchai, the humiliating Treaty of Turkmenchai, because basically after a disastrous war with Russia, Iran gave up not just territory, lost Armenia and Nakhchivan, and the little enclave of Nakhchivan and part of Talish, but more important, it gave up sovereignty. These are the famous capitulations, which removed foreigners from the jurisdiction of Iranian law. So what does Khomeini do? He looks at this sofa and he says, it's Turkmenchai all over again. The Americans are out to humiliate us. And the Shah doesn't say anything. He doesn't care. Not only he doesn't care, he's doing this willingly. He's doing this willingly, just as the Qajar Shahs did. At least they were forced into doing it in 1828. And this was a symbol and a cause that resonated not just with the core followers, the core religious followers, but all the way across the Iranian political spectrum. And who did it? We did. We did. Who do we have? Who did he have to thank? He never thanked us, of course. But that's who did it. And as I say, this is obliviousness. Did anyone at the time think about it? I've asked some friends who were there, and basically no one did. No one did. So we gave him his start in nationalist politics. And in 1979 and 78, as the revolution built up, he was a national figure. He represented Iranian pride and dignity. And if he had some extreme views on religion and politics, so what? So what? Okay. Now, neither side has a monopoly on obliviousness. Here's another example. This was on your right is, of course, Richard Helms, and I talked about that appointment and all of the symbolic stuff things that went along with that. I mean, he might have been the nicest, the smartest, the best ambassador in the world, but who he was and and the history weighed him down. And the symbolism was all wrong. And that was 1972. Now, a couple of years ago, the Iranians did something similar. and they nominated this gentleman, Mr. Abu Talibi. His name does not mean cantaloupe, by the way. Abu Talib, comes from Abu Talib. And Mr. Abu Talibi to be the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations. Now that, like it or not, that position is essentially a de facto Iranian ambassador to the United States. He is the highest ranking Iranian official on American soil. Now, he can't go more than 25 miles from Columbus Circle, but even so, he talks to the American media, he talks to American groups, he talks to American officials, and they nominated this gentleman who had been connected with the Muslim student followers of the Imam, the same people who held us hostage. Now, you ask the question, what were they thinking? Can you make again, the symbolism is all wrong. And it's obliviousness, and this raised a firestorm. This dredged up all the old memories, all the old hostilities from 30-some years before. Now, 2 years ago, in Portland, I would have ended here on a pretty down note. But I think things are changing. Starting back around 2013, the two sides are slowly inching back from the abyss. And whatever you think of the current negotiation process, which enemies on each side, one side of the divide compare to Munich, and the other side compare to Turkmenchai, to say is worse than Turkmenchai, we are now in a very different place than we've been for the last 30-some years. And you can't deny that. I mean, as I say, whether these negotiations fail or succeed. I mean, you have the two foreign ministers meeting in talks that they call productive and positive. Now, think about that. In 30-some years, when was the last time any encounter between Iran and the United States could be described as productive? I can't remember. This is new vocabulary. I mean, in 1979, in New York, Secretary of State Vance and Foreign Minister Yazdi met on the sidelines of the General Assembly, and you can read the accounts of that meeting, which can only be described with an understatement, I guess, as a disaster. It was a disastrous meeting. So between 1979 and 2013, that pretty much was the tone. And now you have something different. Not only that, but not only are the foreign ministers talking productively, but Hassan is talking to Hossein. That's very different. Okay, so we're in a place, we're doing what we haven't done for 34 years. We're in a place with no maps. It's like Narnia. Narnia, you remember, it was always winter and never Christmas. Well, maybe the ice is breaking. And we're on a place with no maps. So we've got to move carefully, we've got to move slowly. Territory is unfamiliar, but we are, undoubtedly, we are in a different place. So let me leave you with one last thought. And that's this. Let's ask ourselves, what happens when for years two sides are unable to talk to each other? Don't care whether it's neighbors, whether it's colleagues, whether relatives, countries. What happens? Well, I would say that the other becomes simultaneously superhuman and subhuman. The superhuman we fear. For example, the Iranians become capable of building and delivering a nuclear bomb tomorrow. We create something superhuman. The U.S. is capable of overthrowing the Islamic Republic with the push of a button. That we are all powerful, all maneuvering. The latter, that's the superhuman. The latter, the subhuman, the superhuman we fear. The subhuman we despise. We despise as we might despise rats or cockroaches because they are not restrained by any consideration of law, of decency, of humanity, religion, morality. Not only can they do anything as superhuman, but as subhuman, they will do anything. Now, I'm not making this up. Think about recent statements from one of our senators and many presidential candidates talked about Iranians all being liars. This is this subhumanization, if you call it. And once that happens, and I fear that it's been happening on both sides, we can rationalize the most extreme and the most ill-considered actions against an adversary. If they are subhuman, if they are superhuman, we fear them. And they can destroy us. If they are subhuman, then we despise them, and we should destroy them. And this is the result, I'm afraid, of not talking. Okay. At this point, usually when I teach, my Naval Academy students are usually on the edge of their chairs and, as you can see here, loaded with questions. This poor girl is still awake. I know that there's a lot of wisdom in this room, and I would love to hear in the time we have left, I'd love to hear from you, and I'll do my best. Thank you so much for your attention.
Cooperation going on right now in a place called Iraq. Military, lower-level military folks are realizing they've got to talk to each other to deal with a common problem. How does that impact this whole beginning of a conversation?
You know, look, you're exactly right. In a reasonable world, we and the U.S. and the Islamic Republic long ago would have discovered that it had common interests in places and things to talk about, not as friends, but as countries, just as we talk with a lot of countries with which we are not friends, but we find common interests because it is in our interest to do so, and it is in their interest to do so. In the case of Iran, this has proved particularly difficult on both sides. On both sides. And I'll just share one story with you. Back a few years ago, the Iranians announced that they were ready to switch on the Bushehr nuclear reactor, the power generating facility at Bushehr. Now that thing was under construction, I think, when many of us were in Iran. It was when the Iranians bought it in the 1970s, it was obsolete German technology already. But anyway, for whatever reason, they decided to finish it and start it up. When that announcement came, a reporter asked Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton, what do you think about this? And she said, oh, we're not worried about it. We know what it is. We're familiar with the facility. We know the safeguards. We know we're in contact with the other countries involved in the technology. This is not something we worry about at all. And then they asked an Iranian official, I don't remember who it was, maybe someone can remember, if remembers this better than I said, what do you think? What do you think about the secretary's comments? And he said, you know, I don't know what it is, but I know there's a trick there somewhere. She's got to be up to something. She's got to be up to something. You know, what do they say? Kasizdinim kasas. There's something's out there. We know there's, and there's the assumption. I think somebody mentioned yesterday. You know, when you think you're going to fail, you fail. You assume the worst happens. The worst happens, and that has been the big obstacle. You know, where there are obvious areas of working together. I mean, I think, you know, what's the cliche? You can walk and chew gum at the same time. You know, you can like something and dislike something else. That's the essence of diplomacy. Somebody wants to find diplomacy as making imperfect agreements with dubious people. And that's pretty much what it is. Think about it. Okay. Yes, Bill.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've always puzzled over, and maybe you can provide some insight, is what was going on during the Clinton administration with regard to Iran. You know that Madeleine Albright wanted to make an overt overture to Iran and was prevented from doing that. And so for the language that she wanted to use in a public address was, she was told she couldn't do it. And I basically an apology for 1953 and other things. And so I'm curious as to what might have been going on. I think you were involved with the State Department during that.
I was involved with the State Department, but not Iran policy. But I can tell you what I do know. It's a good question. It's one of those.
Sanctions were increased during the Clinton administration for reasons I absolutely can't understand.
Well, they came very close to signing. Iran came very close to signing a gas deal that would have had an American company bring Iranian gas, I think, from the Siri field to Dubai, because Dubai was gas short, and the last place they wanted to buy gas was from Abu Dhabi. They didn't want to buy gas from Abu Dhabi because it would have given Abu Dhabi a stranglehold over their economy. But Iran was okay. At the last minute, that got scotched. There was some. I don't know the whole. I don't know the whole story. But I think Hashmi Rafsanjani was a big backer of that project. But I do know that Secretary Clinton, or not Secretary Clinton, Secretary Albright, did make a speech in, I think, 1999, in which she talked about a roadmap to better relations. And she did mention the coup. She did, it wasn't an out-and-out apology, but it was pretty close. I mean, it was, what's to say, it was good enough for government work. I mean, it was pretty good. It was pretty good. And for whatever reasons, the Iranians did not respond. And many Iranians that I have spoken to since said, we really dropped the ball. We should have responded. Now, there was also an incident where President Clinton sent a letter to President Khatami about the Khobar Towers incident, which was not well written or well thought out. The whole thing was badly done. It's a very kind of a sermonizing, scolding sort of communication. And of course, the letter says things like, well, I know it wasn't you, Mr. President, but this kind of language, and got a very sharp response. Well, those are both available. But the incident you refer to, where maybe she wanted to go farther, and it sounds like that, and she was prevented from doing something. It's very possible, but I don't have any direct information.
Actually, it's referenced in Ken Pollock's book.
Okay.
Practically the only thing in the book that's original.
I won't comment. Our colleagues. But it's a good question. But I put that whole episode, Bill, into the category of missed opportunities. You know, that there were chances to get off that road. Sometimes we have missed the opportunity, sometimes they have missed the opportunity. And I think this is one that they missed. The letter may have cleared the deal, I'm not sure, but you know, there's always going to be something. There's always going to be a setback somewhere. But again, for whatever reason, the Iranians did not respond as she had hoped they would. Barry.
Yeah, I was at that presentation, and I heard her say distinctly.
Stand, please.
I was at that presentation when she said directly that we would like to start a new relationship with Iran, and that we know that we've done business really that hurt Iran. And you mentioned most of it. You mentioned several other issues, and she wants to start a new road. Why that didn't happen is something that never was followed up at all. And I don't know of anything in the background, too, that says the administration shut her up or not. I think she was very, very honest and candid about what she was talking about.
I think so. I think so. I mean, we're talking about negotiations with no preconditions in those days, and that was again something that the Iranians had always insisted on. But you know, it's one of those things we need to. You know, a lot of these issues that we talk about, we see them from the American point of view, and we don't. How do we sort of see what was going on the Iranian side? How they saw this? You know, was it simply go back to this suspicion thing? Oh, there must be a trick here of some kind. You know, what are they really up? What are they really up to? Or something else was going. You know, something else was going on. But I don't know. But I think Barry, I wasn't there, Barry, but my recollection squares with yours. Yes, sir.
If I understood your talk yesterday...
Stand up, please.
If I understood your talk yesterday, I believe you said that in your dealings with the State Department that they have a decent understanding on Iran, but that they're not the ones who's making America's foreign policy on Iran. Which begs the question, who do you think is making it?
I was afraid you were going to ask that. Oh, sorry, yes. The question is, yesterday, the question was, yesterday I had said that I felt when I was back in the State Department working on Iran that people there had a pretty good understanding of where things could go and should go, but were constrained by the fact that decision-making on Iran policy was not in the State Department. So the question leads to the obvious question, which is, where is it? Who, in fact, is making policy? You know, I mean, I'll be a kind of a wise ass here and say that when people asked me in those days, who is making Iran policy, I said, well, I can tell you who isn't making policy. But basically, it was the White House and the National Security Council. And what I found, I'll be very blunt here, was that despite some very forward-looking statements from the president, you remember at Oslo when he accepted his Nobel Prize, he talked about dealing with repressive regimes. He said, we've got to do it. We have to do it. He said, I know it lacks the satisfying purity of indignation. Wonderful statement. But, you know, that didn't, the actual people, you know, who were charged with carrying this out were subject to what I called bushthink or oldthink. You know, you read the position papers, you talked to them, and you say, my God, the election in 2008 never happened. Because it was the same kind of thing. People talked about, you know, changing their behavior, you know, and hegemony and all of this other stuff that you know, holdovers from the old days. Now, I admit that the ground had shifted a little bit, in that, you know, back in the Bush administration, a moderate was someone Well, I mean, one side said, we'll change the regime, and the moderate said, we'll change their behavior. The moderate was someone who said, we should bomb them tomorrow. But, you know, as far as anyone was thinking of, was thinking about it. And the reason, I mean, the other question is why? You know, why did this happen? How did it happen this way? And on reflection, and it's easier to reflect when you're not going to these meetings every day, the reflection was, and when I would go to these meetings, I mean, Parvaneh knew I would come home and I would be, she couldn't live with me. She said, oh, you've been to a meeting at the White House, I can tell. Tolerable. But anyway, one of the reasons I think was, something I pointed to was that we were on unfamiliar ground. We didn't know how to do it. You know, after 30-some years of bashing each other, we knew how to do that pretty well. We knew how to insult each other, we knew how to threaten each other, we knew how to call each other names, but creating a new relationship, which was more productive for both sides, people here didn't, people in Washington didn't know how to do it, and I don't think people in Tehran knew how. So when you hit the first setback, and you always do, people reverted to what they always knew how to do. Now, I can tell you one story. I'm sorry I go on like this, but you sort of open the floodgates with your question. At a meeting, we would have these regular Iran policy meetings in the State Department, which I was supposed to preside over, but they had nothing to do with Iran. It was all about how we'd get the Russians and the EU and the UN to cooperate on sanctions. It had nothing to do with Iran. So I was getting more and more frustrated because I felt, you know, why am I here? They don't need me for they don't need me for this. So finally, to kind of illustrate the absurdity of the whole thing, I said, well, I have an idea. He said, because people were looking at different ways that we could punish the Iranians for whatever bad thing they were doing. And so I said, well, why don't we seek to sanction them under the UN Anti-Cannibalism Convention? And I thought, you know, people like they'll see the absurdity of the whole thing. But no. Gosh, we never thought of that. So anyway, that maybe gives you some of the flavor of how these things, why, where the policy is, how the policy, how the policy is made. Yeah, let me go over there.
We've been talking about the issues and nuclear negotiations in bilateral terms.
Sure.
Could you comment on the role that you think the EU, Russian, Chinese, the others have played, and what we should expect their role to be if they do?
I'm going to do my Iran expert thing and say I don't know. Because I really don't. But it's an important point you've raised, that when people criticize, when people criticize the negotiation process, because that's really what they're criticizing, when they say it's a bad deal, there is no deal yet. They're just they're criticizing the process. They say, well, we shouldn't be talking to the Iranians because the Iranians are bad people who do bad things. Well, if we did that, we'd never talk to anybody. But you raise an important point that these are not bilateral negotiations, and there are other people involved. There are other people and other countries and other interests involved, and that's another reason why these negotiations have not dealt with issues which may be very important, like Iran's human rights record, or support for terrorism, or other things, because, and I'm sure the Iranians have other grievances that other issues they would like to raise, but they have not, because they are they are multilateral. And what is remarkable about it, and it's this sort of maybe it's the walk and chew gum syndrome, but that we have been able, despite differences, particularly with the Russians over Ukraine, for example, or with the Chinese over some other issues, that we've been able to keep this coalition working and working together. And I find that, frankly, very impressive, that it's been done. And on the Iranian side, obviously, the instinct would be to try to split. When you're negotiating with a coalition of five, six in this case, you try to split it. And so far, at least, they've not been able to do so. Got a question down there. Sir, I have time for one more question. I'll try to, please.
What do you think, if there is a deal, what do you think of the possibilities of not having Republicans kill them?
You want me to talk about American politics? I'm probably the least qualified to do it. But as I understand the bill that was passed with almost unanimous support, that does not give Congress the power to kill the bill. It gives it certain power over the sanctions that were congressionally imposed. That's basically the limit of it. Now, if the ultimate impression that I have, and this could obviously change, is that if Congress wants to go farther, they run into the fact that they do not have a veto-proof majority, at least by all terms, to go beyond that. So they sort of got as far as they could with the bill. And President Obama may not have liked what he saw, but he saw that they did have a veto-proof majority in the fact of the bill. I mean, what is remarkable to me is that, again, the actions of at least certain individuals in Congress have not, such as the letter, such as the Cotton letter, have not derailed the process. Barry, you remember in '79 how a non-binding Javits resolution sent our whole relationship down the tubes. That's all it took.
Yeah, absolutely. That moment when Javits got up and talked and had that resolution, it made the situation impossible for us to work within Iran at that very difficult time.
What was the resolution?
The resolution had to do with the Jewish population in Iran.
And also the activities of the revolutionary courts.
Right, and revolutionary courts.
The executions.
And what was going on at that time, when I think it was a little bit before you came on, John, was that I was asked, as the only Jew at that time in the embassy, to work with the chief rabbi of Iran to try to get Jewish students into yeshivas and day schools and get them visas as quickly as possible. And the Javits resolution to me said, oh my God, it's destroying everything we're doing. And that's when I gave up. I said, I'm not doing it anymore. The ambassador said, Barry, pull out of it. It ruined the situation.
Yeah. So to answer your question, we're in a different place now. That where 30-something, before something like the Cotton letter would have, I think, sent the whole process, sabotaged the whole process. Today done. Okay, do we have one more question? Okay, a short answer. Short answer. In the far back.
Beyond the nuclear issue, beyond the nuclear issue, I'm sure this is a short question, but I won't guarantee the answer. Beyond the nuclear issue, how do you see the issues of Iran and America aligning?
have a common enemy to the north, to your north, meaning the Soviets, of course. Now, the follow-up question, which probably no one ever asked, was, well, that may be true, but so what? So what? But on that basis, we in the United States made assumptions about what the Iranians would and would not do, which turned out to be disastrously wrong. In other words, we wanted, that pillar of our policy which said keep the Russians out, protect the Iranians from the Soviets. It didn't work anymore. It didn't work in the same way because it was seen as it was seen by both groups on the far left and the far right in Tehran as an excuse to keep America, to preserve American influence over the revolution, and by extension to sabotage the whole revolution. So I would be very careful. One of the things I've always said is we should never lecture the Iranians about what is in their interest. It's a very bad idea. They know what's in their interest. I mean, you can foresee, talking more about anti-narcotics efforts, talking more perhaps about environmental issues in the Caspian, in the Persian Gulf, freedom of navigation issues, safety at sea, safety at sea. What does the military call it? Deconfliction, hotlines, this kind of thing. On a larger sense, Iraq is an obvious one. Afghanistan is another one. I mean, there are lots of things. There are lots of things out there. But my recommendation, I guess, my sense is on these sorts of things, you have to move carefully and sort of beware of making the Brzezinski-esque assumption about what they will not do. Okay, we're getting the hook. But thank you all so much.